How's everyone doing today? Well, how's your test this morning? Do you have issues with cultural issues? I, I don't know. I heard you guys might be a little tired today at the end of your long week. So I said, you know what? No, I will never cancel class. I was like, no, I'm going to try to go for the whole 4 hours because, I mean, instead of studying, you can just spend time in class with me, and that should help you energize for the week. No? Okay, well, we'll see. We'll see how things go today. Anyway, any questions from stuff we covered yesterday or even lingering things from, say, the muscle physiology, anything like that? Everyone's right there with me? I know this topic can be a little heady, just talking about the brain. Okay. Maybe it has been a long week for you guys, but let's continue exercising those higher intellectual functions in your prefrontal areas for a little bit. Now, we used to think that the prefrontal areas were kind of like this locus for higher intelligence in the brain for a good long time, and it does have several functions, but maybe not quite to the same extent that we thought it was. And actually, a lot of the understanding that we have about it is actually from lobotomies. Anyone know what lobotomies are? It's how we used to treat mental illness, like it basically kind of severing the connection there from those prefrontal areas to the rest of the brain. And so it was interesting. What happens after you have a lobotomy? You know, you may think most of your professors might have had one at one point in time, right? Maybe not. Okay, so anyway, so typically what we think about with these prefrontal areas is going to be good for helping like thinking in logical sequences. So if you're thinking about how to logic through a problem, if you're thinking about, okay, I need to run a bunch of errands today, how am I going to organize how I drive in order to make sure I make the best use of gas mileage, et cetera, right? Things like that. And there's a lot of like elaboration on thought processes, right? So again, a lot of things like incorporating multiple sources of information, maybe visual information, auditory information, all of that, and using some of that working memory we talked about, how it gets stored for a short period of time, using some of that working memory in order to logic out, different things. So for instance, you do things like prognostication. What is that? Well, that's a new word for you. It's a 25-cent word for basically saying, okay, well, for instance, if my daughter started to do this. Sometimes she likes to exert a little bit of dominance in the household, and so she'll take something on the table and she'll just start moving it towards the edge, and then I can prognosticate it. So she's going to keep doing that until it falls off and hits the floor, right? You can find that you're not able to necessarily be able to predict very well if you kind of lose function in those prefrontal areas, right? So again, being able to prognosticate, you can then predict, okay, well, if I let you guys go early from class, you guys will like me more than if I say go for the full 2 hours, you will like me less. I can prognosticate those sorts of things based on sort of the information I'm getting from the several nodding heads right now, right? Things like planning, being able to maybe delay a response to a stimuli until I can kind of incorporate all the information, right? So typically what you see with patients who have this kind of prefrontal damage, or maybe they had a lobotomy, you can see that they would have they're very impulsive. Basically, they take any bit of information to react on that immediately. Oftentimes their reactions are very inappropriate. They may seem like they have no social graces, but it just has to do with the fact that those prefrontal areas are not working all that too well. They can't do things like solve philosophical or math problems. They can't really control their activities in context with, let's say, moral laws and codes, right? So again, they act very inappropriate. They may seem like they're being very forward, and really it's just that's how the prefrontal area is working. And we see this pretty frequently when we have like patients with like frontal head injuries. They tend to get. Has anyone ever seen anyone with a frontal head injury? They can be very difficult to work with. Like they get very, they seem like they're very aggressive and they get very angry. So if like you do things like, hey, we need to give you your, get your IV started for today or change your IV, they get very angry with you. They can become very violent in some cases because again, they can't just like logic things out because they have this kind of damage that's being done. Some of that's temporary, but if you have more kind of permanent damage, you can see that kind of being long lasting. Anyway, so looking at kind of functions of the brain as far as communication goes, we talked about lots of different sensory inputs coming in and working together to try to kind of formulate these kind of more abstract sort of thoughts in our head. Remember which area we said was really good for incorporating things like from the visual cortexes and the auditory, or that certain area, start with a W. Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is very, very important for that. And then, for instance, if I needed to translate some of that thought into actual words I'm going to communicate to you, then what area is involved with that? Yeah, Broca's area. That's very important for that. So that way I can actually take those thoughts, translate them back into actual motor patterns that I can express to the motor cortex, and that can then cause whatever muscles to activate that need to cause me to talk, right? And so you can see these pathways here, for instance, going from, say, the primary auditory area See here from the primary auditory area going to Wernicke's area, that's being able to incorporate auditory things, so that way I can understand the words that I'm hearing, or maybe you don't understand the words that you're hearing right now, but you can try to incorporate that area in Wernicke's area and then send that over to Broca's area to then be spoken. Otherwise, you can take things like primary visual information, like if I'm reading off the slide, that would then, those words would then be translated into thoughts, which I can then translate back into words that I will express vocally. And what's interesting is you can have damage done to these areas, and again, you oftentimes see this in stroke patients. In the video I'm going to show you in a second, we'll kind of illustrate that. But you can see things like, having damage done to the visual or the auditory areas can cause specific problems with those features there. So, for instance, if I have damage done to the auditory area, you may have, say, things like word deafness, where I could see that you're talking to me and I can hear the words, but I may not be able to actually interpret those words into anything. It'd be kind of like if you're stuck in a Charlie Brown cartoon talking to the adults. Want, kind of like that. Versus if you have like word blindness, if you had damage done to the visual areas, you may not be able to interpret the words you're seeing on the slide, say, into actual words that mean something to you. Actual damage done to the Wernicke's area. This is where we start to get into things like global or receptive aphasias, where even though you're picking up these words and picking up these sounds and things like that you know to be words, you may not be able to make any kind of sense of them. And so I'm going to show you an example of a patient with Wernicke's aphasia versus one that has Broca's aphasia here in just a second, kind of show you the difference between those two. Hopefully the videos work, which actually I'm going to go ahead and plug this in so that way it does work. But and then additionally, damage to the Broca's area, you would end up seeing that they would be able to decide what to say. They could actually make sense of what they want to, what words they want to communicate, but their brain can't actually make that connection to actually form those motor patterns to make it out of their mouth, essentially, right? So this is what we call an expressive sort of aphasia. Okay, so moving on, talking about things like thoughts, consciousness, and memory. So basically, when we're talking about actual memories that are occurring here, we're talking about kind of reproducible sort of synapses between certain sets of neurons there. And so again, when you have memories that are being recalled, you're actually triggering off the same sort of synapses again as what originally triggered it in the first place. Now, most of the memories that come through are what we consider to be negative. And what does that mean? Like the memory of my test you took was negative? No, it usually just means it's not really anything of actual importance, right? You have so much sensory information coming in all the time, you don't necessarily need to remember every single bit of that information. So usually what you end up seeing is that more useless information or information your mind feels like it doesn't really need to keep as a high priority. It's going to try to ignore that by having the synaptic pathways, those specific ones, actually being inhibited. We call that habituation. We're actually going to kind of downregulate their signaling, so that way if that same signal comes across again, we'll kind of know that it's not really that important of a bit of information. Positive memories are things that you do actually want to consider a priority and try to remember, are going to be things that get facilitated, which means those synapses are going to be more and more easily reproduced, meaning that the next time that stimulation comes along, it's going to be able to trigger off that memory very, very quickly and very easily, and as it becomes more sensitive. And kind of break down memory into two main varieties here. We have things like declarative memory. These are going to be details on integrated thought, which I obviously just said though, but it's supposed to be thought. And again, these are going to be memories of very important experiences. So if you think back about like what your dad looked like, or think about to your 5th birthday, where maybe your dad wasn't there, and then I'm just kidding. No, my dad's the only reason why I'm such a big of a nerd as I am right now anyway, so you can blame me on him basically. But anyway, so those kind of memories, those declarative memories, those are things that you'll be storing. There's also skill memories. So again, these are going to be skills like motor patterns, like hitting a tennis ball or trying to play ping pong or something like that. Yes, sir.
I don't get how your brain differentiates between, like, if I went to Paris, I remember that, but if I go to the mall, I don't remember that.
Mm-hmm.
It's still just visual where I'm at. Why would my brain synapse more when going on vacation than just going to the grocery store or something?
Because going to the grocery store maybe is something that you do all the time, right? Something you do with quite some regularity. Again, your brain just says, hey, this is a normal thing. It's not anything necessarily of that much importance. Just like, what did you have for breakfast 3 weeks ago? Probably have no idea, right? There's actually, you guys ever, there's a podcast. It was called, it wasn't S-Town. It was one before that. Serial, was that it? Was it called Serial? Anyone listen to the podcast? There's Serial, yeah. And the first season of that was actually really good because the guy this guy was basically being put on trial for murder, and they were like, okay, well, what happened 3 weeks ago, or whatever time frame was. He's like, I don't know. I don't remember anything that happened on that day because it was so kind of ordinary, right? So the question was he actually telling the truth or not, blah, blah, blah. But it's one of those things where, again, if you have kind of a normal sort of day where nothing really that important happens, you kind of habituate those memories. Like, it's, okay, I went to the grocery store, big deal. However, if you say go to Paris, which nice humble brag, you can at least say, hey, I actually did get to go, so that's actually really fun. So I remember a lot of the details of that trip, most of it, at least there's certain parts of it that maybe got faded away. But anyway, it was a long time ago. But you'll see that those memories, because your brain's assigning more importance to them because it is out of the ordinary. It's not something that you do every single day. That those tend to get more facilitated, as you'll see there, right? So anyway, so again, two major types here. The declarative, which is more like kind of remembering things, experiences. Skill memory, though, you're going to be that kind of muscle movement. You're going to be able to, the muscle memory, you're going to be able to pick up for these different things, right? Okay, so there's different varieties of memory and how you're going to be assigning these. So for instance, there's short-term memory, which is good for about 7 to 10 numerals, say like of a phone number, like very short bits of information. Maybe remember this for, say, a few seconds to a minute, a couple minutes or so. Obviously, with some repeated mention of certain numbers, you'll remember them for a long time. So, so for instance, if I said 867, you might say, thank you for the one person who knew that song. 5309 would be the rest of it, right? So that's a phone number you'll always know because that's Jenny's phone number. We just know that, right? Anyhow, someone actually put that down on their prescription. So is it yours? No. Oh, it's someone else. Yeah. So anyway, that's the only reason I bring that up. But yeah. So again, those are only going to be while you're actually thinking of the fact. You're just going to drop that memory as soon as you're not really thinking about it much anymore, right? So those are things that's going to be more of the short-term memory. Intermediate to long-term. This is probably what's going to classify the majority of your physiology knowledge. It'll be sticking with you for say minutes to weeks, but as soon as you're not really using it anymore, then your brain's going to say, let's just go ahead and dump this until it comes up again in farm later on. And you said, oh gosh, I should have committed this to long-term memory. Oh gosh, oh gosh, oh gosh, right? That may occur. We'll see. Anywho, but again, unless you activate it enough, you can kind of continue to activate, that memory kind of goes by the wayside. Versus your long-term thought, these are actual changes you can have in the neurons themselves, or maybe they're going to be getting upregulated to a point where they can actually change, the numbers of vesicles they can be releasing of certain neurotransmitters. They can increase the number of presynaptic terminals that are available to activate that. They get very, very sensitive, and they're much more likely to fire off with a much easier trigger than you would see with something that, say in your intermediate memory, like going to, say, the grocery store last week or something, right? Okay, so looking at that, you have to take all memories that come in are going to be short-term to begin with, right? So again, all these little facts are going to be consolidated and to eventually be turned into intermediate and then to long-term sort of memory there. And so typically, this is why we always say when you come into school, we say, hey, at least take 30 minutes to an hour after you've been in class for 8 hours out of this whole long day and just review all of your notes. We tell you that not because we want to punish you by actually having to look at the stuff for another hour, but because this helps with that consolidation. It helps with looking at it again. Will help to kind of re-jog your memory a little bit. Even for like kind of minimal consolidation, if you're thinking about something, say 5 to 10 minutes or so, you can keep that for that much longer. An hour or more even provides for stronger consolidation there, so it can actually be good with you, good for you. But you can find that things can actually wipe that out, right? So you can actually have things that what we consider to be amnestics, or things that help you to forget those memories. So you can see that with a seizure. Oftentimes, patients who develop a seizure don't remember maybe some of the preceding events, so say minutes to an hour or so. You can see this with general anesthesia, right? So again, if I put someone out for surgery, oftentimes they don't remember a lot of what was going on right beforehand. Concussions can do this. We call this retrograde amnesia. So again, if you say are doing something and you have an event that is causing that retrograde amnesia, you'll forget things are happening before then, right? Now, there's a retrograde amnesia. What's the other kind of amnesia, do you think? Yeah, it's going to be anterograde amnesia, which we're going to see is actually going to help us to forget things that are actually happening going forward. And so we'll see that's a little bit different here in just a second. But again, rehearsal helps with this transference. So again, the more you kind of review things, the more it's going to be able to stick in your mind. That's why we tell you to go over your notes over and over and over again. And again, we're going to find that these new memories tend to get codified during this consolidation phase. We can kind of use them to compare and contrast with older memories to kind of see what the similarities and differences are, and kind of helps us with that. So for instance, when I'm trying to teach my 2-year-old what a door is, I show her one version of a door, and then I show her another door and say, this is also a door, and she has to be able to consolidate that and say, okay, well, yeah, this one's red, this one's orange, but they're essentially the same thing, right? So that's kind of that comparison you're making there to help keep that memory intact. And we'll see the hippocampus is going to be the main area that's going to help us to promote storage of those memories. And if you have damage done to those, the hippocampus, you can actually find the inability to produce new memories, right? So we call that anterograde amnesia. And in fact, you can have these patients who will still be able to do certain skill learning, but they can't just make new memories of kind of where they got those skills from in the first place. Anyone ever seen the movie Memento? Boy, you guys' references pool is just not lining up with mine whatsoever. But Anywho, that's a good movie where a guy is unable to make new memories. He has anterograde amnesia, so he doesn't remember things that are happening going forward. As one example, we do this a lot with medications. So, for instance, if I have a patient who has, say, displaced fracture, and I need to get them sedated so that way we can reduce it, we will give them medications. So that way it causes an anterograde amnesia. They actually don't remember kind of what happened from the time they got to the hospital on, because we have basically given them drugs to help them to forget all that, right? So even though they may have been anxious and in some pain, they're not going to really remember after the fact, which is generally good for them overall, right? Anyway, we're also going to see the hippocampus is also thought to encourage memory based on our reward and our punishment centers. It's going to be in the limbic system, which we're going to talk about in a second. So typically our brain is really going to be trying to remember things that activate our reward pathways, because those were good things for us, and definitely with our punishment pathways, because those are obviously bad things for us. We want to make sure we remember those for next time. All right. So moving on and talking about our limbic system in this here. We're going to talk about driving systems in the brain. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Oh, sorry. For anesthesia, so it can cause retrograde and anterograde?
Yeah, depending on kind of how we're using it, and definitely depending on sort of the doses that you're getting and whatnot. So for like general anesthesia, that's essentially where we're like putting you as close to death as possible, right? So as far as like we're sedating you to the point where we have to breathe for you and whatnot, that's like getting for general surgery. That's one level of sedation, versus if I give someone like a little dose of Versed or something, just to kind of help them, kind of take the edge off a little bit. Or for instance, another analog to this that we see quite frequently, like in adult ERs, is people who go out drinking quite heavily. Typically, you remember most of your day up until the point where you start drinking, and then all of a sudden everything becomes a little fuzzier, right? What do you call it, like when you start to have only kind of partial details after, like, say, a drinking episode? That's called a brownout, versus if you go far enough, then you develop what you call a blackout, right? So again, but that's part of that anterograde amnesia. You may remember what you're doing before that experience, but then after that fact, after the drinking has begun, that's when you start to see that anterograde sort of amnesia. I don't recommend actually going out and practicing with that today or tomorrow or anything like that, but again, that is what has been reported as what happens with that. So anyway, everyone's discussing their night plans right now. Just wait a few minutes. Let me finish my PowerPoint first. So anyway, so moving on, talking about driving systems of the brain. When I say driving systems, I mean like 10 and 2, rules of the road. No, I'm talking about driving systems as far as like actually waking the brain up versus actually slowing it back down and getting us ready for sleep. And so most of this is going to be maintained throughout the brainstem. And in fact, without the brainstem being there to actually activate these driving systems, you're going to find that the cerebrum is pretty useless. And you're going to find that if you have patients who develop this kind of compression on the brainstem, say for instance they have something like a pineal tumor, that can actually lead to coma. And the patient's not going to wake up until you kind of relieve that impingement. And so we're going to see that the brainstem is kind of controlling that background level of activity, right? So again, in some cases, you're going to have a lot of activity, say when you wake up in the morning, or say for instance, you have a nice 2-hour lecture right after lunchtime, you may have a little bit more decreased background neuronal activity, right? Maybe. That's why I'm getting no responses for my movie references, I'm going to assume. Anyway, all right, so we're talking about, again, looking here at the brain stem. Okay. Laser pointer. You can see here there's going to be some excitatory areas and also inhibitory areas, and it's good to know which neurotransmitters are going to be actually signaling these different pathways here. So for instance, we can have here the reticular substance of the pons and the mesencephalon. It's going to be the bulboreticular facilitatory area is what that's called there. And basically you're going to find this has a very strong central component as an excitatory drive. So this is going to be kind of one of those things that kind of increases baseline neuronal activity, trying to wake up the cerebrum so that way it's going to be activated and kind of work throughout the day. This is also good because it's going to help control tone in the anti-gravity muscles, right? So you're going to be able to, typically if you're awake, you typically want to have those muscles working so that way it can stay upright, right? And then all these signals are going to be passing through the thalamus. So this is basically going to be this two-way communication between the thalamus to the cortex and back that has to occur. So all this information kind of goes to the thalamus first. And then we're going to find that for very rapid actions to increase neuronal activity, this is actually going to be the job of acetylcholine. So again, acetylcholine is a very fast-acting neurotransmitter. It also gets broken down very quickly. So this is good for kind of quick jumps and increase in activity there. You're going to find there's going to be some other more slow conducting neurons that are going to be better for, say, long-term excitability. So we're going to look at some other neurotransmitters that are going to be useful for that. But typically acetylcholine, here with these excitatory areas, are going to be more stimulatory, trying to wake us up a little bit. Typically, you're going to find that the total area of excitation is going to be determined by kind of the number and the type of sensory signals it's going to be getting there. And typically, pain is actually going to increase this excitation to the greatest degree, which makes sense because typically, if you're getting having some sort of pain occurring to you, you probably want to retract yourself from that and get away from it. Whatever, you need the excitation to occur, which makes sense there. And actually, what you end up finding is a sort of positive feedback loop from the cortex to the excitatory areas during that thought or motor process. So again, if I'm having, say, if I step on something, I need to increase that level of excitation, that those sensory information is going to come up, stimulate the cortex, and then I can have the signals travel back down to say, get off of that nail or whatever happened to cause the pain in the first place. And then typically for the inhibitory areas, we're going to see that serotonin is going to be releasing directly onto the excitatory area to actually inhibit that excitability, right? So instead of just having the excitatory area releasing acetylcholine and other neurotransmitters to open up or wake up the brain, you're going to have the inhibitory area just releasing serotonin onto here, and that will actually just inhibit that more globally, okay? Again, it's why you kind of think of like if you have a big turkey dinner, you have a lot of tryptophan, it turns into serotonin, maybe that's why you get a little bit sleepy, right? Okay. So again, if you're wondering why these brains look a little funny, these are actually rat brains and not human brains, but I think they go and show kind of the similar activity here. Or if your brain does look like this, maybe you should go see a doctor. It's abnormal. But some of the other big neurotransmitters are going to be playing a role here. We know that serotonin is typically pretty inhibitory, which you can see down this bottom one here. But norepinephrine is going to be better for more kind of long-term increase in activity here. So norepinephrine we know is part of the sympathetic nervous system. This makes sense. The norepi is going to be more stimulatory and kind of wake us up. You're going to see that generally it's going to excite the brain and actually gets involved somewhat in REM sleep. We're talking about sleep here in just a little bit. Some of you might be experiencing some REM sleep right now. If so, just dream happy thoughts. Do some ASMR. No, I'm not gonna do that. Put people to sleep. Dopamine's a little bit of a mixed bag though. You're going to find in some cases it's going to be a little bit more stimulatory, and some other areas of the brain is going to be more inhibitory. Remember, this is really important for the basal ganglia and coming from the substantia nigra. Remember, if we decrease the amount of dopamine releasing neurons we have, what do you get? Decreased dopamine means Parkinson's. Remember, Parkinson's, you're losing those dopaminergic neurons again. And so that's one of the big things here. But again, depending on the area of the brain you're looking at, sometimes it's inhibitory, sometimes it's more excitatory. All right, so again, looking at serotonin, kind of see how it's going to be being released here. Again, this is more of the excitatory sort of area. Here's where you have the raphe nuclei, which is going to have the serotonin being released onto those excitatory areas to try to inhibit them there. We're going to find that serotonin is also good for helping to promote sleep, as you're going to see there. As I mentioned, acetylcholine typically is going to be more excitatory. Again, good for more kind of quick sort of increase in excitation. Norepinephrine is going to be better for kind of more long-term sort of increase in those levels of excitation. Okay, next up we have the limbic system. And so again, the major portion of the limbic system, even though it's a relatively small amount of actual tissue, is going to be the hypothalamus. You can kind of see the hypothalamus here along with the whole limbic system, how those are kind of situated there. And we know that the hypothalamus is super important because what does the hypothalamus help us with? Temperature regulation, sex drive in some cases. Hormone secretion. I mean, yeah, like basically our whole endocrine system is kind of at the behest of the hypothalamus, as we saw, right? A lot of those trophic hormones that are going to be affecting the pituitary are going to be coming from the hypothalamus. It makes sense there. So other things like behavioral control, we're going to see a lot of kind of baseline sort of behaviors are going to be handled here through the limbic system. Osmolality in regards to things like ADH and whatnot, we know is going to be really important here, urges to eat and drink. So this will all become important as part of the limbic system. So typically you're going to find that the hypothalamus is kind of the command center for the whole limbic system. Is going to be providing for kind of two-way communication kind of with all levels there. And so you're going to find that as well we're also going to be communicating with the brainstem. We're going to be communicating with the autonomic nervous system. So all this is deeply, deeply integrated. And then you can also have that information being fed up into the cortex as well for more kind of higher level sort of control features there. And again, not a very big part of the brain. However, very, very important that we make sure we have a good functioning sort of hypothalamus for the purposes of the limbic system. So looking at, and again, you don't have to memorize it specifically where all these different things are, but just know some of the functions here of the limbic system, know some of the things that can happen, say if we were to change any of these features here. But looking at things like vegetative functions, which you think vegetative functions, what do you think that means? Things like broccoli, carrots. basically, you think these are just kind of baseline functions that have to be maintained in order for the body to even kind of function, right? So this is where we're talking about things like cardiovascular function. This is where we're talking about things like body water regulation, etc. Now, one of these things I'll tell you, one of the things I see is kind of interesting when I think about things like the limbic system is when we have patients who we pronounce as brain dead, right? So imagine you have a patient who maybe has suffered a significant stroke, or they have drowned or something like that, where basically their brain is dead, right? We've done objective tests that actually show that. We've had neurologists come and say, yes, this patient is brain dead, right? Now at that point, they can do one of two things, essentially. They can either let them go, right? Or we can potentially do what? For the good of mankind, we can, or humankind. We can use their organs, right? So again, if the patient was an organ donor, we could potentially do organ donation. And so actually one of the interesting things there is because we want to make sure we keep those organs intact, we actually have to take over a lot of these endocrine functions for that patient. And so if you ever see like Trans Life come into the unit, you know that they're going to be taking over that patient. They're going to actually make sure everything is kind of kept kind of tip-top shape for that surgery, where they're going to take out these organs and hopefully give them to other very needy people. And so these are things like we have to make sure their thyroid is going to be continuing to work. So we have to give them things like thyroxine to make sure that stays intact. We have to give them vasopressin because we know they're not going to be producing ADH anymore. We have to give them things like blood pressure support and make sure they can control their blood pressure appropriately. All these things we take over because that limbic system really isn't doing anything anymore, right? Because brain is dead. And so things like cardiovascular function is really important here as far as heart rate and blood pressure goes. Typically, you're going to find, and again, I'm not going to ask you very specifically which areas are going to be involved, like inhibiting versus stimulating it. Just know that they can have kind of either function here, right? You know, different parts of the limbic system are going to be in control of this, but things like body temperature regulation, right? So we're going to be able to detect changes in the actual blood temperature itself. As that blood is reaching, kind of affecting the neurons, we can detect that temperature and know, okay, hey, do we need to start vasodilating? Do we need to start vasoconstricting? What do we need to do as far? Do we need to start shivering in order to help build up heat? All those things are going to be important there. We know body water regulation is a big thing. You know, thirst sensation is going to be regulated through things like detecting osmolality in the blood, detecting if we need to release ADH, etc. And then also we know that things like oxytocin are going to be an important component here as well for things like uterine contractility, milk letdown, etc. GI is going to be another big thing here, so you're going to find this helps to regulate and stimulate hunger. There's also going to be a satiety center here as well, right? So some people, we actually have several medications now we're looking at that actually help to stimulate the satiety center to let your patients know, hey, I'm full, I don't need to take in any extra calories. We were originally using these as diabetic products, but now we're actually using them as weight loss products because we know that we can stimulate this center here in the hypothalamus here. And we also know, very important for controlling the anterior pituitary, we know all sorts of hormones are coming from there, so I'm not going to belabor those points. So looking at some of the behavior functions of the limbic center, you can see that by stimulating the hypothalamus, there's different areas here that can be very important for just kind of baseline behavior. So for instance, there's the lateral hypothalamus, which I call the hangry center, because typically when you stimulate this, you're going to have an increase in thirst and hunger, you have an increased level of activity, and also this overt rage and fighting sort of phenomena that can come from this. So again, if you're hungry, typically are you in a good mood? Typically, no, you're not in a good mood, and so this is what I call the hangry center. I'll tell you when kind of a funny tangent. Do you guys care if I go on a tiny tangent real quick? I know you guys want to get out of here, but I just want to check. So when I was first dating my wife, I told her, if I'm ever in a bad mood, chances are I'm just hangry. You probably just need to eat something, and that's all you need to know, basically. So one day we were at my parents' house, and I was putting together like a fan. It was like a big like standing fan or something like that, but it was like wrought iron. It was like super heavy. I was trying to put this thing together, and she was holding the base of it, and I was trying to put it together, and she accidentally drops the base directly onto my foot. Not like drops the base like music, but like dropped the base of the fan directly onto my foot, and so immediately I'm like, and she's like, oh no, are you hungry? Do you want a sandwich? Let me go make you a sandwich. She runs off. I mean, it was very sweet. She meant well. And I said, sometimes it's not actually hangry, but sometimes just you almost chopped off my toast. But thank you. Anyway, she meant well. That's all that matters. Anywho, other things, we can find the ventromedial nucleus is good for things like satiety. So again, if this is being stimulated, typically patients are going to be consuming less calories. They're not going to have that urge to eat. It also can increase levels of tranquility. Usually, after you have a nice big lunch, you feel pretty tranquil for the most part, just kind of chilling out. Things like the fear and punishment center will be located here within the limbic center, and then also things like sexual drive will also be stimulated right here in the hypothalamus as well. So looking at reward and punishment, so we have reward centers and we have punishment centers. Which one do you think has kind of makes stronger signals? typically punishment does, if anything, right? So you're going to find that typically bad things, we like to avert bad things more than we like to go towards good things, typically, right? So anyway, so looking at reward centers, you're going to find that the major centers are going to be kind of located in the forebrain bundle there. What you're going to see is that you can actually have these more potent centers. The more potent the stimulus, the more the kind of potent centers are going to be activated there. And so you can end up finding there's some other ones as well with things like the amygdala and the thalamus, et cetera. But the hypothalamus is probably one of the biggest places you're going to find the big reward pathways. And again, remember I was talking about things like the dopamine squirts. Like those are big parts of the reward pathway. Is saying, hey, this is a big juicy hamburger I just ate. This is delicious. I'm going to release some dopamine, so I know that was a really good thing. I want that to happen again and again and again and again. And then you realize I probably need that satiety drug to kick in at some point, right? There's also going to be the punishment centers that are going to be important for sensations including like fear, terror, pain, probably a lot of what you feel like right before a test or something. That's very strong sort of punishment center activation, I would say. And again, you're going to see that there's different areas that are located in various places. The most potent ones tend to be here in this aqueductus sylvius and around the hypothalamus and thalamus here. And typically what you're going to find is when you're exciting these, they tend to inhibit the reward centers almost completely, right? So in this case, you're going to find that when you have a really strong sort of punishment center activation, it basically shuts off the reward center pathway altogether, such that kind of take it to mean like the stick typically takes precedence over the carrot, right? So again, even if you have something that may be providing a little bit of comfort to you, you're going to find that the reward center is going to be, the punishment center is going to be much more strong of a signal there to say, hey, we probably don't want to do this again, right? Also, what we call the rage pattern, which if you kind of have strong stimulation of the punishment center, especially as what we see in animals as well, this is when they start to have very defensive sort of posture take place, is when they have the kind of growling and piloerection and things like that. So there's really strong stimulus can lead to kind of almost like when you're backed into a corner, sort of like kind of rage patterns there. Typically, you find this is going to be held in check by some inhibitory signals here. And actually, when you actually have more stimulation in some of those reward centers, so when you actually find you can reverse that and cause some placidity, some tameness in the animals there. So again, that is one pathway that we also have. As far as memories go, sensations that tend to stimulate the reward or punishment pathways tend to become pretty well reinforced. Like, so we like to remember the things that made us feel good, and we definitely can't help but remember the things that made us feel bad. So I think about all the dumb things I said like last year or whatever happened to be that are going to come back and haunt me again and again when I'm trying to go to sleep, right? But again, things that don't really stimulate either pathway, right? They're going to be discarded. It's that habituation that happens again where it says, hey, this is not really that important. I can probably forget about this. No problem, right? Okay, any questions so far? Do you guys want to do a 10-minute break or do you just want me to finish up? Finish? Okay, I have relatively few slides to go, but you know how I can drone on a slide. But anyway, let's talk about sleep. Hopefully none of you are experiencing sleep right now. But so let's say this is basically going to be unconsciousness from which a person can be aroused, usually by stimulatory or sensory or some other kind of stimuli there. Coma, although, is going to be when you basically cannot be aroused whatsoever. So again, oftentimes, how do you I don't know if anyone's ever tried to wake up a patient who's maybe drugged or something like that, but what's some of the ways you try to wake them up? Yeah, I do sternal rub. Has anyone ever tried to give themselves a sternal rub? Doesn't feel good. You can also do nipple twisting sometimes to try that, see if that works. Sternal rub usually the first thing we're gonna do there. But yeah, so I mean, you can have patients who are completely unresponsive even to these really painful stimuli, and that shows you definitely they're definitely comatose. Can you have patients who are maybe faking a coma? Absolutely. Sometimes we'll do what we call the hand test, where sometimes they're laying back in the bed, we'll raise their hand up over their head and then drop it, and if they are able to move their hand away, we probably know they're faking, right? Versus if it hits them right in the face, and okay, that probably means they're actually Some people get around that though. They can even fake that sometimes. I think I heard one story that said there were basically two paramedics were in the back of an ambulance transporting a patient. They were pretty sure the patient was lying about their condition. And they said, okay, well, and they're just talking to the other paramedic. It's like, oh, basically, if I raise their hand up like this, if they're really, really sick with whatever, then they'll keep their arm like that the whole time, and we'll drop it down. So the patient ended up keeping their arm up the entire ride into the ER. So patients do some funny things. Anyway, let's assume our patients are actually being legitimate here. Two main types of sleep you're going to be seeing. There's going to be our rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep. Roughly, this is about 25% of sleep you're going to be seeing there, and usually occurs around 90 minutes or so after kind of a patient initially goes to sleep here. Typically not very restful. We'll talk about its functions here in just a few minutes, but typically this is when you're going to have mostly kind of the vivid dreams actually happening during REM sleep. Lasts about 5 to 30 minutes or so, and what you'll notice is that as you go through these cycles here, what do you notice about the REM cycle? It's getting longer typically, right? So you're going to find that it's going to be relatively short during the first sort of cycles, and then it gets longer and longer and longer until they actually kind of wake, the patients kind of wake themselves up, right? So again, typically short or absent very early on, and then tends to become much more frequent later on during the sleep cycles there, okay? We also have our slow wave sleep, or non-REM sleep here, and typically you're going to find very strong low frequency waves. So again, this is, imagine if you had an EEG or electroencephalogram attached to your patient via electrodes on the head. This is what the waves would actually be looking like as they're going through the progressions of different sleep stages. And typically, this is kind of the first hour of sleep or so, is we're going to find the kind of the most restful sleep actually occurring here. Okay, and kind of what do you notice about the waves as they go from, say, an awake state down to kind of deep sleep? So kind of notice the actual frequency of waves, slower or faster? Yeah, typically slower. What do you notice about the amplitude of the waves? Yeah, they're a lot higher. So we're going to look at why that is in just a few minutes here, but it has to do with kind of overall neuronal excitability going on in the CNS. We'll look at the different waves here in just a few minutes. So anyway, REM sleep, again, we associate that with kind of active body movements. You see a lot of like myoclonic jerks and things associated with REM sleeps where you're having a lot of dreams as well. And the patient can actually be pretty difficult to arouse during this actual sort of dreaming state. However, typically when you're waking up, you tend to wake up from a REM state of sleep. So the patient can spontaneously awake, but they may have a hard time if you were trying to wake them up during that, right? Because everyone ever like wake up right in the middle of a dream, like right before you get to the good part, you wake up. That's because you're waking up from REM cycle essentially, right? So you're like, oh, I'm going to go back to sleep and hopefully get back to the dream, and it never works, does it? No. Anywho, you can also find muscle tone can be depressed here. So this is due to having some inhibition in the spinal control areas, right? Remember talking about the brainstem releasing serotonin, partly on the brainstem can end up leading to some of that muscle tone depression. You'll also find that heart rate and respiratory rate tends to be a little bit irregular during here. There's a little bit more kind of vacillation than you would see in more deep sleep. And then you may have these myoclonic jerks that occur here. So kind of irregular muscle movements. You ever have that like right as you're drifting to sleep, you have that sensation of falling and kind of jerk? Those are those myoclonic jerks that happen there, right? Anyway, the brain, though, is pretty highly active in this state. You actually find as much as a 20% increase in metabolism called paradoxical sleep. And some people postulate this because this is a time for us to try to kind of collate through all the memories of the day and try to see which ones need to be habituated, which ones need to be facilitated, try to kind of make sense throughout the day. So still a period that is necessary. However, it's not really the most restful time for us to sleep. Versus a slow wave sleep tends to be more kind of really deep restful. Typically, you're going to have more depressed blood pressure, respiratory rate, and basal metabolic rate.
Those jerks only happen in REM? Because they usually happen like right when you fall asleep.
Right. So yeah, not just in REM, but that's what typically we're going to see them as well. So if you're like, you ever see like your dog like kind of like look like chasing rabbits or something, like that's kind of what's happening there too. Anyway, so looking at this, as I mentioned, the raphi nuclei, we believe that sleep is being induced by having serotonin trying to inhibit those excitatory centers. It's a very helpful thing. There's also some other neurons and some other hormones we think are going to be involved here. There's one called the orexin neurons. Another name for it is going to be hypocretin. And this is actually produced in the hypothalamus and is thought to produce excitatory effects on orexin receptors, which kind of makes sense. Orexin would work on these orexin receptors. And actually, we don't know a ton about it, but we do know what happens if you're missing this. If you lose those signals there, it actually leads to what we call narcolepsy. What is narcolepsy? Yeah, it's kind of random falling asleep at random times. Cataplexy, which is if you have, like I say, a sudden loss of muscle tone. There's actually some really like crazy videos you can find if you go like search cataplexy on YouTube. Like girls, sometimes like strong like emotional signals can stimulate this. So for instance, like they'll like start laughing all of a sudden and then just like fall down to the ground. Like it's kind of nuts. But if you didn't know any otherwise, you'd think, oh, maybe the patient is having an arrhythmia or something like that. But that's their cataplexy, right? And actually, some of the drugs that we will use to help correct things like narcolepsy and cataplexy are working on these orexin signals here. Even though we don't know fully the whole system and how it works, we still can try to give them medications to try to help correct that. Again, still a lot we don't know, but we're learning more and more as time goes on. Okay, so looking at brain waves, and I just thought it was a really cute picture of a little baby, little electrodes on its head. So looking at the EEG or the electroencephalogram, this is where basically we're going to be measuring the electrical potentials from the scalp, right? And so again, we're having to measure these signals through the brain, through the scalp, or I'm sorry, through the bone, through the scalp and the hair. So in those cases, it can be kind of difficult to get really good signals. So we're kind of getting an overall sort of global picture rather than picking up individual things like individual heartbeats like we can on an EKG, right? But basically, you're going to find really marked changes whether you're dealing with someone who's, say, in a wakeful sort of state, whether they're asleep or having a seizure, for instance. So again, looking here, looking at the actual frequency of the waves, you can see here with surgical anesthesia, you'd imagine it'd be pretty slow. This looks probably pretty similar to what you'd see like in a really deep restful state. And then as you have someone kind of starting to wake up a little bit more, say they're in a state of relaxation versus attention versus having, say, like a full-on tonic-clonic sort of seizure here. And again, having too rapid a firing here is not going to be good for our level of consciousness, as we'll see in just a few minutes. But basically, what we're going to be finding is that most of the time, the brain waves, when we're, say, in a state of active attention or something, we're going to find that they're pretty irregular and they don't really have any kind of specific pattern. So again, you're going to see sort of these like really fast sort of waves between, like, say, alpha and beta waves. What you tend to find is that a lot of the neurons are firing one direction, other ones are firing another direction. They tend to cancel each other out for a large amount. So that's why when you see someone who's, say, at active actual attention, they're paying attention to something, you tend to find that the actual amplitude of the waves goes down quite a bit because a lot of the neurons are canceling each other out from an electric potential standpoint. On the other hand, though, if you have someone who's like going to sleep, everything's kind of slowing down a lot. You're going to find that a lot of those cancellations will stop or not be happening because a lot of those neurons are not firing, and that's why you see the actual amplitude go up, even though the actual firing of the neurons is slowed down, which is why the actual frequency has gone down pretty dramatically. Okay. So anyway, and again, you have to have a lot of action potentials just to be right at the scalp because it has to travel through so much material is basically not going to be conducting that very well. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of neurons cancel each other out, which is why in active attention, you're going to be finding that the actual amplitude is not going to be very big compared to, say, more deep restful state. So looking at the alpha waves, you see here maybe 8 to 13 cycles per second, so fairly quick, but they're found in pretty healthy adults when they're awake, maybe just quietly resting, just kind of sitting there and they're not really doing very much. They tend to disappear during sleep. And again, you find a lot of these signals canceling each other out, which is why they kind of look like this. Now, if you notice, we're going to find that the beta waves are going to be a little bit faster, say 14 to 80 cycles per second, so much more quick. You're going to find that the beta waves tend to replace the alpha waves while the attention is being directed towards something specific. So imagine patient's eyes are closed here, having alpha waves. They open their eyes, have these beta waves, and they close again. It goes back to the alpha. Why do you think that is? Because instead of just looking at the back of their eyelids, they're now taking in a whole picture, right? They're able to take in all this kind of sensory information. They're looking at things, they're fixating on things. All that information is starting to trigger off a whole lot of action potentials occurring, which is why you see those beta waves. So again, beta waves are typically more associated with you actually thinking about things, actually being really attentive to things. Some of you might be having some beta waves right now. Maybe not. Maybe I'm seeing a lot more theta or delta waves. Who knows? But typically, you're going to find that when things start to slow down a little bit more, you're going to see more of these theta waves. They're going to be slower than the alpha, typically higher in amplitude. These are found with more states like emotional distress, or starting to find degenerative brain disorders. This is where these start to kind of replace a lot of the normal alpha and beta waves. And then finally, the delta waves are going to be the slowest, much greater voltage, due to the fact you have a lot less of that canceling out. You find it's definitely in deep sleep. In infancy, in a lot of cases, you'll find this as well. And then in very serious organic brain disease. So for instance, if you're evaluating a patient, say, for hypoxic injury to the brain, and they're having not a whole lot of function going on there, you're going to see a lot of delta waves. And that is usually how it's going to be reported by the neurologist on the report. So again, if I'm looking at one of these, I don't really get a whole lot out of it. However, I can read the neurologist interpretation and actually get some ideas of what's going on. So if they're saying, hey, there's a lot of normal, healthy alpha and beta waves, nothing bad's going on, versus like they see nothing but theta and delta, maybe, unless the patient was asleep, you're not really expecting to see that normally, right? So I'll just have to take into the clinical picture. Let's talk about seizures. What is a seizure? Yeah, it's kind of abnormal, excessive firing of the neurons. Basically, this is the normal disruption of brain activity, right, or a disruption of normal brain activity by this uncontrolled excessive neuronal activity, right? So basically, similar to an arrhythmia in the heart, the same thing's happening up here in the brain to cause a seizure. Lots of causes for this, right? So you can see things like electrolyte disorders. Hyponatremia can be a big one, that can lead to seizures. Hypoglycemia is another big one. So anytime you're evaluating a patient for, say, altered mental status, syncopal episode, a seizure, what do you got to check on them? You got to check a sugar, right? So one of the first things you're going to check is you can get an AccuCheck pretty quickly as far as the point-of-care testing goes. That's definitely going to be a big thing you're going to check there. A lot of toxins can induce seizures, which I won't bore you with the whole list right now, but just know there's lots of them out there that can do so. And in fact, just like I was mentioning how antiarrhythmics can cause arrhythmias in the heart, guess what a lot of anti-epileptics can do in the brain? They can cause seizure, right? So again, this is one of the other things we'll run into. We'll talk much more about that in the pharm courses. Stroke can do this, trauma, lots of reasons why a patient may develop a seizure, right? So a couple of different varieties of seizures you can have. We're going to have talk about focal versus generalized seizures. What do you think when I say focal that means? kind of happening like at one point, and potentially they're spreading out, or just more staying kind of localized here. So typically starting with a very local, small sort of area. So you can see here would be a seizure focal region. So again, one part of the brain is basically starting the overexcitability there, sending off those inappropriate action potentials. In some cases, you may find they can have propagation throughout different parts of the brain. And we'll talk about generalized seizures in a second here, but sometimes these focal ones can actually progress out and become a generalized seizure, which basically the whole brain's kind of firing inappropriately. Now you can have some cases of, say, a simple partial, maybe there's no change in consciousness, or maybe the patient develops a seizure but actually does not have any depressed level of consciousness, which you would normally find. Or you can have a more complex partial where they do have an impaired conscious. Typically, patients are going to have a depressed level of consciousness associated with these seizures here. In some cases, you may actually find they can be predicted with an aura. When I say an aura, what does that mean? Patient starts glowing purple or something? It's sort of like a prodrome of symptoms, like something they kind of sense, like and just like people with migraines can develop an aura and they know when a migraine's coming along, these patients can potentially know when a seizure is going to be coming along. They may have changes in their sense of taste or smell and things like that. Anything that can be kind of predict that they're going to be having a seizure can be reproducible in some cases. Could be motor tics as well. Any of those could be potential signs there, right? Now, when a patient has a seizure, and they stop the seizure, which these may be stopped on their own, or it could be stopped with, say, the intervention of medication or something like that. There's going to be a period of time where they're not really back to their baseline mental status, and we call this the post-ictal period. So if you find a patient who maybe had a seizure and they're stopped that seizure, so they don't have any more activity of that seizure, but then they're not really back at their normal baseline, you can't really communicate with them very well, that's usually the post-ictal period. So what would happen, you say, if you had a seizure, you go into that post-ictal period, but then you have another seizure before you go back to baseline. What do you call that? Anyone ever heard of status epilepticus? That's what we call that, basically, where you have these patients having kind of prolonged seizures and they never really get back down to their baseline mental status before they develop another seizure. That's a very serious medical issue that we need to treat very aggressively, usually in the ER and the ICUs. You have status epilepticus, basically uncontrolled seizures, continue on. But there's also generalized seizures. These typically are going to, and here's an example of, say, a focal seizure that went more generalized, versus here we have a primarily generalized sort of seizure here. And again, if you talk to a neurologist, they could probably go on for days talking about the differences between how these might present. Again, typically when we see them coming into the ER, we see a lot of generalized tonic-clonic sort of seizures most frequently. And when I say generalized tonic-clonic, or otherwise known as a grand mal seizure, typically they're losing consciousness. Typically they're having sort of these spasmodic sort of muscle contractions that are occurring there. And the biggest concern we have is going to be airway compromise. So very frequently we may have to, if we can't control the seizure and they're not able to oxygenate on their own, then we oftentimes have to intubate them for their own airway protection there. Patient may also become incontinent. So that could be another big thing you see with that as well. They're losing kind of all control of muscle function, right? And there's also what's called the absent seizure or the petit mal seizure. And so this is basically going to be just involving certain areas of the thalamocortical activating system here. And typically this is not really associated with a whole lot of like muscle manifestations here, but typically you're going to find maybe 3 to 30 seconds or so, fairly quick of these levels of unconsciousness. You may have a little bit of twitching, but most often than not, you're going to find patients just have these like staring episodes where they may start like kind of stare off, and they come back into it pretty quickly there, right? So again, most often I see most of y'all have absent seizures several times throughout my lecture, I'm assuming, right? You should probably go see your neurologist. I'm just kidding. Anyhow, but we're going to find they all have different ways of treatment. We'll get into that much more in the neurology section in Pharm later on in future days. So by show of hands, who would like me to go on to the last section of notes? I see, for the video's sake, I see all hands, but I say, you know what, I'm going to be nice. I'll let you guys go early on this Friday. Any questions? Yeah, no problem. See y'all later.